Hi everyone, welcome back. I've been down here all day shooting stuff for the Fault Line Film Festival, so that's why you see this fancy red curtain behind me. The lesson we're going to be working on in After Effects is something called rotoscoping. Now, what rotoscoping allows you to do is to separate foreground objects from the background. Now, in some cases, if you have access to a green screen, you would definitely want to do it that way, where you film somebody in front of a green screen and separate them that way. But sometimes you're just working with existing footage that already has everything kind of put into it, and you need to take that person away from the background and do different things to either the background or the person. That's where rotoscoping comes in. There's a tool in After Effects called the Roto Brush that allows us to trace on the video and then separate things. So that's the one we're going to be working on today. We'll see you down in the lab. Okay, let's get started with lesson 9. Go ahead and begin with save as, and we'll call it lesson 9. And we've got just one thing to bring in, and that's under lesson 9 assets. You'll find boy. Don't worry about face tracking. This will be a footage item. Bring it in and let's start a composition based on that footage. Just dragging it over here. And this is the footage that we're going to work with. So you see the boy here, we see the background. What we're going to try to do with the rotoscoping tool is cut him out from the background, which will allow us to change the background or change him depending on what you're wanting to do with this project. Okay, so let's figure out how to get into rotoscoping. You'll see up here at the top on the tool panel, this little icon right here, Roto Brush Tool. Okay, you see the shortcut for it, Alt-W, which is a hard one to remember, so you might just click on it here to turn it on. Now when you notice that you turn it on, nothing's happening here. That's because with the Roto Brush Tool, you need to work in the layer window instead of the composition window. So let's go ahead and double click on our boy layer, and that will open up our layer window. And now all of a sudden you do see something new. This is the Roto Brush that we're looking at right here, this green circle. Now you can change the size of this brush simply by going to your brushes panel and changing the size right here. If you don't see the brushes panel here, just go to Window and select brushes right there to see it. However, there's a shortcut for changing your brush size. Just have your brush inside your composition window and then hold down on the control key. And as you hold down control key, I'm just moving my mouse left to right to resize my brush. Now for this, we probably want something fairly large, probably in the 150 range as far as pixel size. Because what we're going to do is first define a rough area that we want to cut out. So all you need to do is just kind of draw a big green area down the middle and across. And you notice what happens. You'll see this kind of purplish boundary appear around the boy. This is called the segmentation boundary. And this is going to define the area that gets cut out, that basically becomes the foreground. And of course you see these giant areas here that didn't get selected, so we can just go over and grab some of that to start highlighting it. But at some point you're going to find that this large brush isn't going to cut it anymore. You need to get smaller details. So I'm going to go ahead and reduce the size of my brush so I can start getting some of these things up here on the top of his hat. See right here the little flap on the hat. I'll go ahead and try to grab that. Here on kind of the top of his coat, you'll see some areas that didn't get picked up. I'll just keep trying to grab that and just really look at areas like this. They're kind of hard to see, and you probably don't see it on my screen. But there's just a little tiny piece that didn't get picked up here. So be sure to check for areas in his coat that didn't get selected. This little flap right here, that almost never gets picked up the first time. So I'm going to go smaller on my brush to get it, and hopefully that grabbed it, which it did. Here's a small area here as well. Maybe just a little bit more on the top of his hat. And maybe just a little bit here. And just kind of looking around, that looks pretty good on the outline. I'm going to go back and fix this here in a second. Some of you might have noticed, though, there's a little opening right here between his coat and his hat. And this is actually something we want to cut out. But how do we do that? Whenever something inside the segmentation area needs to be removed. Well, how we do that is we're going to go with the red brush. The red brush is the subtract brush, and to get to that, we're going to hold down the Alt key, and notice my brush turns red when I hold down Alt. I'll make it larger real quick just so you can see the red. Okay, so there's my removal. Now, anything out here you don't have to worry about removing because it's already removed. We're just looking at these small areas like this that are inside a segmentation boundary. That's what we need to use the red brush for. So let me get my brush smaller so I can get into that small area here. I'm going to hold down Alt. There's my red brush. I'm just going to click once, and that grabbed it right there, just that one. Now there was a little piece up here that I want to get rid of, so I'm going to hit Alt on that, and that got rid of that as well. And that's starting to look pretty good. Okay, so I've got my initial base frame created, but this is moving video. So I'm going to have to keep going forward to check this boundary to make sure it stays clean. Now After Effects is pretty good at maintaining this boundary. As we go from frame to frame, it's pretty smart and it will stay with most things, but there are times whenever it's going to lose the boundary and you need to go back in and fix it. Now before we do that though, I just want to show you a couple of things. Here at the bottom on the layer, you'll see some different views that we can have of a RotoBrush screen. This one right here is called Toggle Alpha, and that's going to show you basically transparency areas out here in the black, and then the opaque areas here in the white. So this is all stuff that we're going to keep. This is a nice view because this will show you really easily things that you missed, things that didn't get cut out. There's another one here at the end called Toggle Alpha Overlay. This shows you just what it might look like with a changed background. And then to get back to the segmentation boundary, that's the one right here in the middle. Okay, to go forward, whenever we're wanting to kind of work on new layers or new frames of this composition, I want you to look at your keyboard. Okay, we've got arrow keys that move forward, but we don't want to use those. We want to use the number 1 and the number 2 keys on your keyboard. But be sure, I know a lot of you are using laptops and you don't have a keypad, but some of you might be using a computer that does have a keypad. It's important that you use the numbers on the keyboard itself. So I'm going to press the number 2 on my keyboard, and you notice I move forward 1 frame here. So you're just going to check this out to make sure there were no changes. And really I didn't even notice the video move there, and sometimes that will happen. You're still on the kind of the same frame as you move forward. But there I saw a distinct change. So I'll go through and analyze to make sure my boundary still looks good. And that does look pretty good, so I'm going to go forward again. And I'm watching it some more as I move forward. Now at some point, this little gap right here by his face is going to start opening up. I'm not going to grab it yet, but pretty soon I'll probably need to take a peek at that. If you ever make a change that you don't like, just hit Control-Z undo, and that will get you back where you need to be. Don't worry if this is not super clean. There are ways to kind of go in and refine this edge, which I'll show you and talk about. At this point, I might go ahead and grab that little notch right there. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink it down as much as I can on the brush size. Alt, red brush, click, and that grabbed that right there. I'm about 5 frames into the project right now. That's when that started opening up. Okay, so we can just keep going forward, looking at this. I'm not gonna sit here and make you watch me do every single frame. So I'm gonna go forward a few frames, and then I'm gonna show you something new that we're gonna try to do about 1 second into this project. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, I've made it to 1 second into this video, and for the most part, my boundary has been holding together pretty well. The one place I was noticing problems pop up was right here on this edge where his coat was separating from the edge of the frame. That's where I had to go in and clean some things up every now and then. And I don't know if you can see this on your own screen, but you might notice here on your timeline underneath the boy layer, here's the rotobrush effect, and you see all these strokes that you've been creating. That's just showing you all of those areas that you have defined. So you can always kind of go back and change, add, delete things as needed. Okay, so if you look at this, you might have noticed this kind of long line underneath the timeline. Almost looks like alligator skin. And this is basically a rotobrush span that determines the range that you can add this rotobrush tool to. Now at some point, if you have a really long video, the span might get so long that it takes too much time for After Effects to compute everything going on. It's going to really bog down your system. This video we're doing right here is not long enough to really cause any problems, but I'm going to show you how to create what's called a new base frame, which will allow us to, I guess, shorten the necessity for these spans so that we can speed up the rendering process. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my playhead forward to an area that's off the span. For me, I got to 120, and that's where it kind of went away. For whatever you're doing, just move it to where it's off the span. Now you might notice whenever we did that, our boundary disappeared, or at least now it's here on the edges of the frame. So when you create a new base frame, all you're simply doing is what we did the very first time we started. We're going to just define our area. So we're just going to start from scratch. Use the big brush just to get started. Shrink that brush down to get the details. All the same kind of trouble spots we had before are probably going to be causing you the same issues now, especially there in the hat. And just the little flaps of the coat. And sometimes you'll see you'll have to go in and use the red brush to remove areas that you don't want to be part of this. I'm going to try to shrink my brush a little bit here and really get into that tiny space there. And that got it pretty good. Okay, so whenever I created this new boundary, look down here, you'll see this new kind of blue frame. This is a base frame. You saw the initial one we created way back here. Well, here's another one, and it created a new span right here that kind of connects to the old span and moves forward. Now we do have this big stretch right here in between kind of the 1 second mark and the 120 mark that we need to go back in and clean up because there's no green lines here to indicate that we have cleaned up the span during that. So now I need to go backwards. So instead of the 2 button, or the 2 key on my keyboard, I'm going to press the 1 key. So I'll press 1, check my boundary, looks good. Maybe I'll just grab a little bit up here. Let me get my brush back. Hit 1 again. And sometimes you have to wait on this a little bit. Let it kind of compute. If it's doing this kind of blue line thing right here, let it think a little bit before you move on. Get that green line showing up here. This one got a little bit rough on the edge, so I'm going to clean that up. But that looks good. And I'm going to keep continuing this backwards until I connect this green line with that green line. Once I finish that, I can jump back to this point right here at 120 and then continue forward all the way to the end of the video, about 3 seconds in. Okay, so once again, I'm not going to make you sit here and watch me do every single frame of this. So I'm going to finish going backwards with the 1 key. I'll jump back forward here to my base frame and then go forward to the end. Just keep an eye on this span. If this span ever kind of isn't keeping up with you anymore, you can always drag it right here to extend the length of it. But it should automatically move forward as you continue through. Okay, so I'm going to finish up, get to 3 seconds, and then I'll talk about the next step. Okay, I've made it to the end of this video. I've got the whole area rotoscoped. I did have to drag this span, probably you did too. Sometimes it'll move automatically, but I did have to grab it and drag it to the end to make sure that I didn't get off the span. Because if you do get off the span, you'll have to start creating new base frames from scratch. But if you want, you can just go back and take a peek at the boundary you created, and hopefully you're not seeing any major problems with the boundary. There are some different tools you can use to maybe soften up the edge a little bit if you'd like. If you look up here in the Effect Control window under Roto Brush and Refine Edge, Roto Brush Matte, there's a few controls here that you might want to play with. For example, we might increase the feather amount. This is just going to soften that edge a bit. I might pump that up to 10. Reduce chatter. This is just going to clean up some of those little stray things that want to kind of bounce around. Where you see those kind of rough edges, that'll kind of smooth that out as well. And I can go ahead and try to play that real quick. And I know it's really hard to see, but maybe on yours you can see maybe the edges look a little bit smoother than they did before. There is another tool. I'm not going to show you this specifically, but if you click on the Roto Brush tool, underneath it you'll see something called Refine Edge tool. And you can use this to go in and really clean up those more organic areas, like this little fuzzy area on his hat that don't have a real sharp edge to it. Refine Edge can get you in there and help grab some of that detail that might be lost on the edge. But for what we're doing, we don't have to get quite that detailed with this. Okay, so I'm going to save what I've done. And once you have the segmentation boundary, everything's rotoscoped out the way you like it, this is when we need to save all of that. And the way we save this boundary is we need to go down here to the bottom of your layer, bottom right, and you'll see something called freeze. That's going to basically lock in your segmentation boundary. Now, depending on how long this takes, I might go ahead and cut the video so you don't have to watch the whole thing, but once it gets through all this, we will have saved this boundary, and now we can start working with it in our timeline. And it looks like it might take a little bit of time, so I'm going to go ahead and cut here, and I'll start it up again whenever this is done. Okay, my rotoscoping has frozen. I've gotten through all the video. I'm now ready to go back to my composition, and I can see that we have cut out the background. This is all transparency at this point. So now we can kind of start playing around now that we've cut out the boy from the background. Now, let's say we do want to get the background back and start changing it, maybe adding some color to it or whatever. All we need to do is go back to our original footage item here in our project panel. I'm just going to drag that to the bottom of the stack. So there's my background. If we were to play this right now, everything looks normal. It's like we never did anything because these two are completely in sync with each other. But if I just made a simple change, let's say I go to the background. In fact, I'm going to rename this background just to keep things straight as I'm working. Let's just say I add a simple color effect to this. Let's just say I change it to black and white. Now all of a sudden we have the boy in color with the black and white background. And we could do any kind of color effects back here we want. We could blur this out if we wanted to. Just imagine all the effects that you could add to a layer. You can make it happen on this layer right here and can create some really interesting effects. Of course, vice versa, you can make all your effects be happening here on the boy instead, depending on what you're trying to do. And let's say we want to add a text layer to this. So I'm just going to go, I'll save this real quick. I'm just going to go here and I'll type in something. The book says type in winter blues, and I will change that to be much bigger. And I might retype since my typing is not great. But check this out. This winter blues layer, depending on where we place it, can go behind the boy like this. We could even animate this winter blues so it went behind him like this. There's all kinds of cool things you can do once you start separating parts of a layer from another part. So I think this is a really interesting tool. It's a little bit tedious. You have to be a little bit OCD, I think, to do it well. But there's all kinds of applications for this. It's just kind of taking the time to get through it. Okay, we're going to go ahead and cut this lesson here. So that's all we have for lesson 9, rotoscoping. I hope you like the rotoscoping tool. I think it's a pretty cool feature in After Effects. It's not too difficult to work with, and I think there's a lot of things you can do with it. We do have one more lesson to get through, and with this final one, I just want to go through a bunch of very short lessons showing you a variety of tools in After Effects. So the next time we get together, we'll go through that. Hope everybody's doing well. Take care. See you next time.